Hello and welcome to episode 11 of
The Fantastically Terrible Podcast. Today's discussion is about two African Americans whose undeniable talent changed the comics industry forever.
Do Tell.
And if you're wondering why I got this voice, it's because it's my 1950s broadcaster voice. So we're going to talk about George Herriman today, born 1880 and passed away 1944. He created Krazy Kat that ran from 1913 to 1944, one of the most revered comic strips ever made. When the Comics Journal chose its greatest comics of the 20th century, Herriman's comic strip was numero uno. There is arguably no comic work as canonical as Krazy Kat. The comic counted Cummings, Picasso and De Kooning amongst its fans. That's some crazy stuff.
That is.
In the wild, wild sports of comics. And Matt Baker, born 1921 to 59, who created the endlessly imitated good girl style in comics. He created the first black superhero, Voodah.
In 1945.
That's right, and was the artist on the first graphic novel ever made. It rhymes with lust. We'll discuss their groundbreaking work and put their lives into historical context to truly understand the struggle they must have had during Jim Crow era America. Their stories are not well known, but they should be. Because, racism. So let's start with Matt Baker, who was born 1921. His first break in comics was landing a job at S.M. Iger Studios as a background artist in 1944.
Right, and that studio used to be Eisner and Iger.
That's Will Eisner.
That's right. But then Eisner sold his half of the company.
That's right. He just decided to say,
Adios.
Adios, I'm gone.
Yes. In Iger Studios, at the time, there were what they called shops or packagers.
Right.
And they would provide outsourced comics to publishers, including Marvel.
Right.
And they were uncredited, though.
Right.
And Matt was one of these.
He worked as a background artist and did many female figures for other artists. His first credited work was as a penciler and inker. That came with Sheena, Queen of the Jungle, number 69, in 1944. The following year, he created or co-created what is considered the first black superhero, Voodah, in 1945.
I love that name.
He was like black for the first 6 issues, and then they started coloring him white. It's like...
So a black comic art, and then the first successful black comic book artist creates arguably the first black superhero.
Right.
And they turn him white.
Yep.
All right.
That is the whole history of our nation.
Yeah, that's true.
Now, in 1947, he redesigned Phantom Lady for Fox Comics. He had an incredible way of drawing the female figure and is seen as the master of the good girl art style. In the early 1950s, Baker drew romance comics, and later on he went on to draw westerns and sci-fi comics and stuff. In the 50s, he would illustrate what many consider to be the first graphic novel. It Rhymes with Lust.
Great name.
Published in 1950, and at the time, the writers Leslie Waller and Arnold Drake called it a picture novel.
Interesting.
So,
Which
yes.
now we call a graphic novel from Will Eisner.
Right.
It all points back to Will.
Well, as a black man, this is amazing to me. This is from David Hadju, author of The 10-Cent Plague. He had a gift for drawing anything well and women extraordinarily, which helped him avoid the steel mills that awaited other young Negro men of his time and place. So he was just exceptionally really super talented.
Yeah.
Matt Baker was the envy of everybody. He was always dressed impeccably in broad-shouldered, double-breasted suits, stylish silk ties. He lived in Harlem and he drove a yellow convertible coupe.
Nice.
However, even though he dressed well and was talented, it doesn't mean he didn't have problems. As Arnold Drake, the writer of It Rhymes with Lust, pointed out, we were extremely fortunate to have him, and St. John's is to be admired for having hired him in the prejudiced climate of the time. It's amazing to me. hearing about Matt Baker, especially because, many years of drawing comics and stuff, it wasn't until recently I heard about Matt Baker.
Okay, well, that's a good lead into a book that was published called Invisible Men, The Trailblazing Black Artists of Comic Books by Ken Quattro. And I'll have links to everything we reference and more on our website. And in there, it does go through the works
18
of
profiles,
18.
and he talks about the shops, and he had a hard time. He says there wasn't that much. And then he said there must have been other comic book artists that were black. And lo and behold, he started to discover this when he started looking at the black newspapers, black magazines that were referencing these artists. And he says once he started to do the research, he started to see how overwhelmingly prejudiced the system was.
Well, of course, especially 1965 or before.
Right.
They had segregation.
Right. Think about this, too. You're talking 1940s and 1950s America,
right.
where a black man is drawing extremely gorgeous white women.
Oh, that's true, too.
That's the kind of thing that would get you lynched in a certain other place. It's kind of wild.
Yeah. A different circumstance, a different audience, sure.
Right. And it's a reminder that with all this stuff going on, that when we think of a period, there's a lot of contradictory stuff that's happening.
Absolutely.
In any given period.
Maybe now we'll talk about our next artist that we want to highlight, which is George Herriman.
Yes.
And he was born in 1880 and was right at the birth of comics and also the film industry, too.
Right.
They were really hand in hand, and he was a huge influence on countless artists who openly pay homage to him, like Will Eisner, Charles Schultz from Peanuts, Robert Crumb, Art Spiegelman from Mouse fame, Bill Watterson, Calvin and Hobbes, Chris Ware, we know from Jimmy Corrigan.
Hugo Pratt, fame of, my favorite, Corto Maltese.
So many people point
the guys
to
from
him.
Asterix.
Like across fields,
yes,
different
across
art
fields.
styles. Absolutely. You can see,
Yeah.
actually, maybe I'll put a link. There's a little video where you can see something from Dr. Seuss and his influence from Krazy Kat. And they actually had a page where it looks very similar. And they weren't stolen. Like, they openly said, we got this and we were inspired by Herriman. And it's quite interesting, his story. So he was born in 1880 and died in 1944. So I guess he passed when the Golden Age started.
What's interesting is that the same year that he passes away is when Matt Baker gets his first job. It's almost like
they
picked
the
up the baton. But what's interesting is that no one knew he was colored, quote unquote.
Yeah.
He was black. So they only discovered that.
So on the opposite spectrum, where you had Matt Baker,
very open.
right, and then you had George Herriman, who nobody knew until I think almost 30 years after he died.
Yeah, about
when
that.
they found his birth certificate to say he was mixed.
Yeah.
His whole family was actually. They were Creole
Right.
from Louisiana.
And there's no mixed back in Jim Crow. That whole one-drop rule insanity that was going on. And yeah, he was from New Orleans.
You have to put it in the historical context.
Yeah.
He was born in 1880. That was
Right. In New Orleans.
post-Reconstruction in New Orleans with the Black Code.
Yeah.
Later to be changed to Jim Crow. So this is his whole life.
Yeah.
And his whole life is, if you're black, you can't work. You have to show. Even his father had Herriman tailor shop, and just to go from their house in New Orleans to the tailor shop, they had to show papers.
Right.
Like, it was ridiculous. I mean, the whole point of the Black Code and Jim Crow was to not allow black people to vote or to participate in
Right.
any way, not to own anything, not to get loans, not to own
Right.
property. Absolutely restrict them.
And you're right, because today you say mixed, right?
Yeah.
Back then, they just
Black
said
or white.
black or white.
Right.
So-
But it is true, because Louisiana has a strong French history, has a
Right.
strong Spanish history. So that's why it's totally not unusual to be mixed. And I think that's why they were so strict.
Right.
When they wanted everyone to be either black or white, pick a side.
Yeah.
And depending on what side you're on, you
I've-
have no rights or you have all the rights. Like, as I look a little bit into the Jim Crow laws, which went all the way to 1968.
Yeah.
This isn't way in the way back.
And my dad lived
machine.
through it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They didn't pass the Civil Rights Act until 1965.
Which I will add, they had a Civil Rights Act in 1867, which they didn't enforce. It took them 100 years, almost 100, to have one that was enforceable.
Well, that's why they had the Jim Crow laws.
Yeah.
In order it was through the whole country, but in particular so that the South had to adhere to Reconstruction laws from the federal government.
Right.
But then they just passed local laws to disenfranchise.
Right.
And so he couldn't have worked legally. He couldn't have
No,
voted.
he couldn't have.
He couldn't have done any of those things. So
That must have been a tremendous weight.
yeah, I agree.
A tremendous weight on him.
So it wasn't just like a choice. If no one asked and he didn't say, and he can actually work and buy a house and marry who he loved.
Yeah.
I mean,
That's...
everything he did was basically illegal.
Yeah.
Just living his life was illegal.
Just his existence.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting because his comics,
Exactly.
his
That's
comics,
why I
you
think
see
in the
he's telling you.
It didn't come out until 1971. On his birth certificate, he was Creole. It's interesting having that information and looking at his comics.
Yeah.
And I'll have links to his comics and samples and lots of different articles on the era that he lived in. And, race riots. We spoke about this on our
Yeah.
first show, actually.
And many of them were just massacres.
Exactly.
Riot,
They
to
call
me,
it a
is,
race riot, but it wasn't. They were
It
massacres.
wasn't. Yeah, they were
but
massacres.
we're talking about right in his period, like in there were insurrections. Oh, the Wilmington insurrection. I mean, we're getting off topic. Okay, I won't go. I'll have links to everything.
Yeah, we'll save that for another episode.
Yeah, we'll have
Bryce.
that.
Yeah.
But during this period of the early 1900s is when they were lynching hundreds of people. It's a period of extreme oppression, suppression, and you can't discount his time.
No, you can't.
And when you look at his comics, as you said, like Krazy Kat, a cat in love with a black
Right.
cat in love with a white mouse.
Yeah.
And
the white
never
mouse
returns his affections.
Yeah.
And typical slapstick comedy where he throws things at him and
Right. Which has been like, he tells you in the comic strip, that's pretty much been the relationship in America forever and a day.
Yeah.
So I find it intriguing, and to me it pains me that he wasn't able to. I mean, they would have guessing games as to what he was, and eventually...
Yeah, apparently even where he worked, they would tease him so much about his hair. That's why he started wearing a hat.
Yeah.
So it's interesting when you dive into things. Like people say, oh, he wore a hat to hide his hair. But then you find out he wasn't wearing a hat right from the beginning.
Right.
People would just constantly say, oh, what's going on with your black kinky hair?
Right.
And then he started wearing a hat.
Probably because he was afraid of getting,
I'm sure he was afraid and tired of it too.
Yeah,
right?
it's comedy. They said he was quiet too, and I imagine
Right.
probably being quiet.
Yeah, he's supposed to be one of the nicest people ever.
Yeah.
He always worked right up until he died. His work was on the table for that week.
Wow.
Very hard worker. He worked for a very shady person, William Randolph Hearst.
Yes.
We have so many stories about, including...
Citizen Kane.
Yes, the famous Rosebud. But for some reason, he seemed quite nice, at least according to Wikipedia, to George Herriman. And even as popular as his comic strip was for a good 30 years, in the last few years, it wasn't as popular, but Hearst continued to pay him at full salary.
Yeah.
When Herriman died, he said no one's going to take over his comic strip.
Yeah.
He died, and his comic is no one's going to do it after him.
Right.
So it's very interesting that he seemed to get quite a high respect from Hearst.
Yeah.
Which is unusual, especially for a comic artist too.
Yeah. It saddens me because at the end, it's like whether it's Matt Baker or George Herriman, it makes me think how many people out there that were these amazing talents, and just because of their
They weren't white.
dosage of melanin,
Yeah.
they
Who knows, right? You
Yeah.
had to hide you were Mexican. You had to
Right.
hide you were Puerto Rican. You
makes
had to
me
hide
wonder
you
how many
were-
black women, how many.
Oh yes, yeah.
I mean, we're focusing. It's very male oriented in this,
Well,
but
we'll do a show on maybe the hidden women in comics industry because they're even at Disney. We know that they were so many women artists that never got credited.
Right.
So
Right.
we'll try to find some key ones, because if they're not credited, it's hard to find them.
Yeah, it is really
But we'll
hard.
do a little research for a future show on that.
But it was very. It's sort of interesting though with the two. One that has to hide it, and the other one was sort of like, yeah, I am.
Yeah, that's
It's
what's
just kinda
wonderful
wild.
about Matt Baker.
Yeah, it's
It really
wild.
is. And in his time, it was extremely prejudiced. And, unfortunately, with the comics code, he got nailed.
Yeah,
But
that
he
hurt him.
continued to work afterwards.
Yeah, but he died young, so
Yeah. So there's some things with Herriman that, again, you have to put it in his time and place. And one is in his early years, he did it for only, I think, 2 or 3 months. But at the time, they had a Sambo character that was very
God.
common.
Yeah,
and I
even
think he's called
Miser.
Mose, like Moses Mose. And there are a lot of different comic strips that had a super exaggerated black figure.
yeah, the Sambo.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And he partook in this. But it was only for 2 or 3 months, and I looked up and I thought, oh, that's sad. But when I looked up the strips, and I'll have links to them on our website, I found them quite interesting.
okay.
His was called Musical Mose, and it's right at the beginning, early 1900s.
Right.
And he only did it for a while, and as soon as he could, I think he dropped it as soon as he could. Because you
Right.
see, like on Wikipedia, you see the list of all of his titles that he worked on, one right after the other.
Right.
And what he did was, all of the characters, white or black, were not very attractive.
So they were all ugly.
But actually, the black character, the main character, Mose, was quite sympathetic, even though he's drawn in that style.
Yeah,
And you can
that's
see, you'll
hard.
judge for yourself.
Right.
But the 3 that he drew that I found online were very interesting, especially now that we know he was not white.
Right.
So his perspective is different. And so Musical Mose is about this typical character who picks up an instrument, and it's the same scenario. So in one, he finds an organ, like the organ grinders, and there's a sign, he's with his wife, and there's a sign that says, oh, the instrument anyone can play. So he picks this up, he gets a job to play it, and he starts playing it, and everybody's like, wow, that sounds wonderful. They're really into it. And then at this time, the stereotype was Italians would play the organ, right? And so an Italian saw him playing it, and he plays with accents too. He's really good at vocabulary
was known
and
for that,
dialogue.
yeah.
So if you read it as though you have a broken Italian accent, it sounds quite. You can follow the melody, and even Mose speaks in a bit of
Choppy.
slang style, choppy style. So then the Italians see that he's playing, even though at first they like it, then they don't, and then they beat him up, and then at the end he's in the hospital, and he's not going to play, he's not going to organ grind anymore.
Right.
Another one is he picks up a flute, and he starts playing beautifully with this flute in an Irish Celtic style.
Right.
And I thought it was interesting in this one, it was women. Women hear him and they think, oh, that's beautiful music. And they're Irish, so he plays with the accent as well in his dialogue.
Right.
And when they see that he's black, they beat him. Again,
Wow.
that's the scenario, right?
Right.
It's supposed to be ha-ha, slapstick, funny. And then at the end, he's not going to play the flute anymore.
Wow.
And in another one, it's with...
I'm sensing a trend.
Yes, exactly. I know. That's why he only did a few. But you just get, if you're from the time,
Right.
you just get the slapstick part. Who is this guy? He's playing music, and then these other ethnic groups beat him up.
Right. Pointing out the racism of...
Okay, so in another one, where it's Musical Mose impersonates a Scotchman in the title, with sad results. That's the title of the strip.
Oh, God.
So he plays the bagpipes. He does a fantastic job. Scottish immigrants hear him. They think it sounds beautiful. They follow the music, and they see that he's black. They insult him. There's racial slurs. They beat him. And so again, it's the same scenario. But very interesting that there's a word bubble on the bagpipe that says, I wish my color would fade.
That's interesting.
And then again, the shtick is he's with his wife at the end, and his wife is like, "Okay, you shouldn't. You're gonna have to find another instrument or something else."
Right,
And he
right.
agrees.
But that's interesting. I wish my color would fade.
Yes, like the music, because they're talking about the bagpipes. You know, the sound is fading from the bagpipes.
It's interesting too, though.
Because you look at this at first blush and you think, oh, you know, typical characters in Sambo.
Yeah.
But what is he saying? He's saying immigrants, even immigrants who are the bottom rung, still beat up on African Americans.
Yeah.
They're still at the bottom.
And it's
And
interesting.
even if they're exceptional, even
Right.
if you like what they do, even if you like his music,
Right.
he still gets, once you know he's black, you don't accept it anymore.
So I wonder if the editors said, we want you to do a Sambo character.
Oh, yeah. This wasn't his original character.
Oh,
Mose
okay.
was an existing Sambo type character.
Okay.
He did musical Mose.
So he basically
He took the character and said, okay,
and
I'll do
flipped
this
it.
with it.
He flipped it.
Yeah, I haven't seen other ones, other Mose comic strips.
But he
compare
flipped
to.
it by showing how racist the other ones were.
I mean, I don't know if I'm reading it in a modern context,
Right.
but I don't know how you cannot get that knowing.
But he only did it for a
knowing
few
who he
months.
was. Yes, and he was out of it. I think
And
he did it from January to March, and he didn't do it again.
Well, yeah, so probably it's just because he had to do it because the editor asked him to.
Yeah,
What's interesting is that he was a big supporter of Jack Johnson.
he was. And actually,
Yeah.
I read that they were not allowed to depict black characters in cartoons unless it was a Sambo style.
Yeah.
You were not
yeah,
allowed to.
Yeah.
So he was actually trying to figure out a way to depict Jack Johnson and other athletes, and they didn't want to insult them.
Right.
And that's where he came up with drawing them as animals. So he has, he drew the characters as very strong looking cats.
Right.
Almost panther-like cats to show their strength.
That's clever.
Because he wasn't allowed to draw them.
Right. Right.
None of them were allowed to draw them, not just him.
Yeah.
So even in the cartoons, everything that's what I was saying. Everything had a restriction and a law,
Yeah.
and it wasn't verbal law. It wasn't politically correct. It was literally the law.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. There's a book by, I believe the author's name is David Pilgrim. It's called Understanding Jim Crow. And I read it. Believe me, it's really a tough read. But all these Sambo characters and all that stuff there, it's still, when I see those characters, they make me feel so uncomfortable.
It's made on purpose
Right.
to dehumanize them.
Yeah.
That's why it's made to dehumanize people. Everything in the culture was made to.
It's like getting scapegoated.
It's more than that, right? It's to remove any semblance of humanity.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was the point of those laws. It wasn't until 1968 that the Jim Crow laws were finally
Dismantled. Yeah.
It wasn't until
I'd like to know that they were dismembered. That
it
would be
wasn't
good.
until 1968 that the final Jim Crow laws were off the books.
Yeah.
But if you look into it a little more, there was an article I found that in Louisiana, it wasn't until 2018, 2018,
Oh, yeah.
that they
Well, that's
had
David Duke country.
they had, and Louisiana is where Herriman is from,
Yeah.
right? So his father took all of his kids, everyone, and moved to LA when he was 10 years old.
Well, my father's family also ties back to Louisiana. They had to do the same thing.
Yeah, everybody had to leave and somehow go north if they could. And in 2018, Louisiana finally ended a Jim Crow era law. Everyone assumes that when you are tried in a criminal court, you have 12 jurors,
Right.
and you have to have a unanimous decision, or else it's a hung jury.
Right.
In Louisiana, because of Jim Crow laws, you could do it without a unanimous decision. You can have a conviction, including for death penalty, without a unanimous decision. And this was obviously to have convictions. You say we're going to have a trial by jury. Well, we're going to fix the jury.
Right.
And we're going to intimidate you. And if it doesn't matter, it doesn't have to be unanimous. So they were showing, and I'll have a link to this article.
Wow. Well, I'm not surprised.
No, and
Yeah.
they through all the research they showed that it was completely unfair, And it was still a remnant of Jim Crow in the Louisiana law that they only got rid of in 2018.
Yeah. I can only imagine, like, for Herriman having all this on his back.
Yeah, because he was at the time, right?
That's
exactly when things were tough. The KKK came out in the late 1800s. They were lynching people in the 1900s. They would have lynched him.
Oh my God!
They would have completely gotten rid of him.
And you know, the thing is that there's been when people talk about passing, it's always seen as though, you know,
You mean passing for white?
for white is seen as though, oh, okay, you're getting certain privileges, but
Right.
it's like being in enemy territory and being the imposter.
It's
and
bad
if they
all
find you
around.
out, you're done.
Yeah, it's bad all around. If you're
Yeah.
lighter, you get to do more, which is horrible.
Right.
And that's all these remnants of race.
Right. But if you
And-
get discovered back then, oh, you mean you're actually black, or you got black? It's over.
Well, even now in our discussion, we're still picking a side,
Right.
right? I mean, his family on both sides was mixed, and apparently on his mother's side they were Cuban, and I'm sure on
Right.
the Cuban side they were mixed,
Right.
and maybe Native American as well.
Right.
But when you go to the States, even
That's right.
today, you're
That's
black
right.
or white.
You know, like, for all intents and purposes,
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty much the same as
Yeah.
George
You're
Herriman.
mixed.
I'm mixed, but I know that as soon as I set foot in the States,
Mm-hmm.
that mixed stuff doesn't matter for squat, especially
Right,
when
right.
a cop stops you.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of understanding.
And you and your brother
understanding.
look completely different.
Oh yeah, we looked completely different.
And it's just shows you how stupid and arbitrary it is.
Mm-hmm.
And it's to me, especially if you're like, let's say your mother's Puerto Rican and your father's African American. I mean, you're still raised and eat and have the culture of your mother,
Right. And of
so
your father.
of your father too. But it comes down to color, not culture.
Yeah.
It's not my dad's American, my mom's Puerto
Yeah.
Rican. It's
Yeah.
black and white.
Yeah.
It's or not. I don't know. Whatever.
Right.
But it's a shame because it's your cultural heritage that's
Yeah.
your background. You're American or you're not. But it's never like that.
Well, you know, one day we'll go into talking about where it all starts, and it starts for
Yeah, we
control
should have a
reasons.
big post-Civil War episode.
I'd go right back to the 1600s with the Bacon's Rebellion.
Well, we might have to do multiple.
Yeah, because I mean, they
You
actually
know
had
more pre-Civil War history,
Right.
And I'm pretty good at post-Civil War.
But what's interesting is that you go back to like 1723 when they start bringing in laws that a white person could not be in the presence of a black person that wasn't their slave.
Yeah.
Like, that's how deep that they instilled that hatred, all to ensure that they kept the dollars turning out. So,
Right.
you know, I mean, this is just like an offshoot. It's just like a virus that just evolves. So I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to talk about my grandfather. And in the early 1930s, my grandfather, who was visibly African American, but, you know, he was also Native American, had European, all that, mixed, essentially. But the craziness of the country is
Right.
you're just black.
Right.
So he had a cousin that could pass for white. So in their teens, they decide we're going to drive through the South. So they would stop at a hotel.
Okay, so they decide, let's go on a road trip.
Road trip. Exactly. Thank you. That's the word. Road trip. So they would stop at a motel. And my grandfather's cousin would go to, you know, ask for a room. And, you know, the person behind the counter would be all happy and amiable. And then all of a sudden, they would look over and see my grandfather by the car and they'd be like, you can stay, but he can't. And my grandfather's cousin would look over and say, oh, no, that's my driver. They're like, oh, okay, he can stay, no problem.
Right.
And it's just like, that's insane.
It is insane. I mean, you just are who you are.
Yeah, it's almost like black and white is seen so separate.
Black and white in the U.S. becomes a culture unto itself.
Yeah, but it's like they're seen so separate that there can't be any relations between the two. It's really sad. So when I hear that story, and then I think of Herriman, I also think too, there's a lot of pain going there because there's a lot that you have to the
What
attempt
another person would just have naturally.
Yeah, yeah. And that's probably, I think, why he was quiet. I think that's probably why he was quiet and stuff. And you see it in his work. But anyway.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting person in general to study their artwork. It's interesting for the history of comics and art. And it's also interesting with a race perspective.
Yeah.
To analyze his work.
And other than like jazz and rock, comic books is an American medium.
Good point.
So, when we think of rock, we think, man, Chuck Berry, Little Richard. When we think of jazz, we think of Miles Davis, we think of Dizzy. But when we think of comic books...
Well, even earlier than them, but yes.
Yeah, even earlier than that. I'm just, throwing out names here.
Right.
But
the blues.
When you think of comic books, I don't know, you might think of Milton Caniff or something. You're like... But then here you find out the Herriman, who is the guy that influences all this, his mixed. And it's just like, man, do we have to keep going through this over and over and over again? It's really sad.
Yes.
So...
there's still articles about... did you know that this person was black or this CEO was? And it's sad that they still have to do that.
Hidden Figures.
Yeah.
And my dad's an electrical engineer. And Hidden Figures, this is how Top
the
Secret
movie
was.
Hidden Figures about the computers, the mathematicians who were women working at NASA.
Black women.
Oh, yes, sorry. Women and in particular
Black women. And I'm sitting there when we first watched the movie, I'm like, okay,
how do
this
we
is
not
2000
know that women
and something.
were mathematicians at NASA?
But this is 2000 and something, okay? Like, I could understand maybe in the 60s they didn't want to say it. I don't know why they wouldn't. Fine. 70s, pushing it. 80s, come on. 90s. And then all of a sudden into the year 2000, the 2000s.
Well, it's like I
we
mentioned,
discovered
in
this.
Louisiana, it was only 2018 that they said it was illegal to have non-unanimous jury decisions to convict.
Right. So I think when we think that these things are so far away, like they're not.
No, not at all.
They're not. My dad went through Jim Crow. My granddad went through Jim Crow. And then if you go to his dad, it's like pretty much you're starting to enter close to the Civil War.
Yeah,
so it's not that far away from
wasn't it your grandfather had to choose to stay on the res or not, didn't he? Or was that
my
your
great-grandfather?
Okay.
Yeah, my great-grandfather. And he had to choose to stay on the res or not, primarily because, well, that's a whole other different story.
No, but again, it's making them choose. Are you black or are you Native American?
Well, there was the whole blood quantum.
Right.
And the blood quantum was, if you were white and European and you had Native American, you could get away with being Native American and getting land, no matter how little that blood quantum was. But if you were black... and you had Native American, it didn't count.
Right.
So, because the black blood was, it's just insane.
Well, we'll talk about this on a future show, but your father wrote a book on your family history.
That's right.
And you're doing kind of a abridged, more reader-friendly version.
Yes.
And we'll talk about that because your family history is crazy.
It is very crazy.
And it's definitely worth one or two shows.
Yes.
Because you got lots of stuff going on.
Yes, unfortunately, and there's some people I wish I wasn't related to.
Yeah.
And there's others that I'm happy I'm related to. But the ones that I wish I wasn't related to is a reminder of how messed up people are when money is involved.
So do you have any takeaways for today's episode?
Yes, actually, this one I feel is very personal to me on many levels. Family history, my own personal experience, and hope we get to a point where you don't have to hide or be targeted, where talent can be seen for talent. I hope one day, and I don't like to appear like the dreamer, but that's my big thing, and that's my takeaway from it. Today's fantastically terrible character or creature is Sylvester J. Pussycat Jr., known simply as Junior from Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies.
He's famous for putting a paper bag over his head and declaring,
"Oh, Father, Now, what's the big idea of that?
I'm ashamed to show my face in public.
Now, cut that out!
Oh, the shame of it all.
That's it for today. 7Robots Fantastically Terrible Podcast is by Miguel Guerra and Susie Diaz. Our theme song is by Susie.
If you'd like to support our podcast, the best way is to leave a review on iTunes. This helps others to find us, and we will see your name and personally thank you live on the show. For more information on this episode, including links to everything we've referenced, please visit our website at www.7robots.com/podcast.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.